On the morning of October 24th, 1861, a 32-year-old operator named James Gamble tapped out the first official transcontinental message from San Francisco to Washington. The textbooks call it the moment America was wired together. The textbooks are wrong about almost everything except the date. By that morning, more than 50,000 miles of telegraph wire already crossed the United States, operated by dozens of companies most people have never heard of. The line Gamble finished was not the first. It was the last one allowed to exist. I came to this through a door I did not know was open. My friend is a conservator. She works for a small museum in the Midwest that holds a collection of 19th century railroad and communications equipment, most of it donated by descendants of operators and linemen who kept their grandfathers' tools in barns and attics for 100 years. She is not a historian by training. She is a metallurgist who learned history because the objects in her care kept contradicting the labels written for them in the 1950s. One afternoon last spring, she sent me a photograph of a brass telegraph key with a maker's mark she could not identify. The mark read NY and MVP and a date, 1853. I looked it up that evening. The mark belonged to the New York and Mississippi Valley Printing Telegraph Company, founded in Rochester in 1851. By 1855, it operated more than 4,000 miles of wire across 9 states. By 1856, it had merged with several smaller companies and changed its name. The new name was Western Union. I had assumed, the way most people assume, that Western Union was the original American telegraph company, the one that invented the network. It was not. It was the 41st. That number stopped me. I went looking for the other 40. What I found bears almost no resemblance to the story I learned in school. The word telegraph itself comes from the Greek tele, meaning far, and graphein, meaning to write. Writing at a distance. The term predates electrical signaling by half a century. Before Samuel Morse, there were optical telegraphs, semaphore towers, chains of hilltop stations passing messages by mirror and flag across France and England and the German states. When the electrical version arrived in the 1840s, it did not arrive into an empty field. It arrived into a continent already organized around the idea that information could move faster than a horse. The first commercial electrical line in the United States ran between Baltimore and Washington in 1844. Within 6 years, there were 12,000 miles of wire in operation. Within 10 years, there were over 23,000. The companies that built them were small, regional, and fiercely independent. The Magnetic Telegraph Company ran the eastern seaboard. The New Orleans and Ohio Lynch lines crossed the south. The California State Telegraph Company connected San Francisco to Marysville and Sacramento by 1853, 8 years before the Transcontinental line was finished. The Pacific and Atlantic ran through the Ohio Valley. The Erie and Michigan ran the Great Lakes. Each had its own equipment, its own coding conventions, its own training pipeline for operators. The operators are the part of this story almost no one writes about. By 1855, there were approximately 10,000 telegraph operators working in the United States, most of them trained in apprenticeship systems that lasted between 2 and 4 years. They learned not just the code, but the equipment, the chemistry of the batteries, the maintenance of the lines, the repair of the insulators. They moved between companies. They carried their knowledge with them. The records of the National Telegraphic Union, founded in 1863, document a workforce that thought of itself as a craft, not a labor pool. I keep returning to that brass key in the photograph my friend sent me. It was made in 1853, in a country that already had a working telegraph network from Maine to New Orleans, from the Atlantic coast to the western edge of the Mississippi Valley. The men who made it belonged to a company that would be absorbed 3 years later into something larger, which would itself be absorbed 10 years after that into something larger still. The key outlasted all of them. It is sitting in a drawer in a small museum, waiting for someone to remember what it was for. The company that became Western Union was founded in April 1851 as the New York and Mississippi Valley Printing Telegraph Company. Its founder was Hiram Sibley, a former sheriff and machinist from Rochester who had no background in telegraphy and no particular interest in the technology itself. What Sibley understood was consolidation. Between 1854 and 1856, he and his partner Ezra Cornell, the same Cornell who would later found the university, executed a series of mergers that absorbed 11 competing companies into a single regional network. In April 1856, they renamed the resulting entity Western Union Telegraph Company. The name was a description of strategy, not geography. By 1859, Western Union had absorbed somewhere between 40 and 50 smaller companies. The exact number is difficult to establish, because many of the absorbed firms left no surviving records of their own, only entries in the acquisition ledgers of the company that bought them. The historian Robert Thompson, in his exhaustive study Wiring a Continent, published in 1947, documented 42 named acquisitions before 1860. Other researchers have found references to as many as 60. The companies that disappeared include the Atlantic and Ohio, the Lake Erie, the Wade Lines, the Speed Lines, the House Printing Telegraph Company, and dozens of smaller regional operators whose names survive only in newspaper advertisements from the 1850s. I want to be careful with what comes next, because this is where the evidence and the textbook story begin to drift apart. While Sibley was consolidating in the east, other lines were being built across the west that had nothing to do with him. The Pacific Telegraph Company of Nebraska, organized in 1860, began stringing wire west from Omaha. The Overland Telegraph Company of California, organized the same year, began stringing wire east from Carson City. Both companies were independent of Western Union at the time of their founding. Both employed operators trained in regional apprenticeship systems. Both used equipment from small workshops in Rochester, Cincinnati, and Philadelphia, workshops that would themselves be absorbed within the decade. The Pacific Telegraph Act, signed by President Buchanan on June 16, 1860, authorized a federal subsidy of $40,000 per year for 10 years to whichever company could complete a line from the Missouri River to San Francisco. The contract was awarded to Hiram Sibley, personally, not to Western Union as a corporation, though Sibley used his Western Union connections to organize the work. He subcontracted the eastern half to the Pacific Telegraph Company and the western half to the Overland Telegraph Company. Edward Creighton, the Omaha Railroad clerk, was hired to scout the route and supervise the eastern segment. James Gamble supervised the western segment. The line was completed on October 24, 1861. Within 2 years, both the Pacific Telegraph Company and the Overland Telegraph Company had been absorbed into Western Union. The men who built the line did not own it for long. The federal subsidy that made the construction possible flowed through Sibley's hands and into the consolidated company he controlled. By 1864, Western Union operated approximately 44,000 miles of wire and held a near monopoly on long-distance communication in the United States. The pattern is worth pausing on. The 1860 Pacific Telegraph Act did not create a competitive bidding process in any meaningful sense. It awarded a single 10-year subsidy to a single contractor, who immediately used the funds to acquire his competitors. The same congressional records that document the subsidy also document the objections raised by smaller telegraph companies, who believed they had been excluded from consideration. Their petitions are preserved in the records of the 36th Congress. They were not answered. The railroad historians have written about this pattern in the context of the Transcontinental Railroad subsidies of 1862 and 1864. The same Congress that subsidized Western Union's consolidation of the telegraph network subsidized the Union Pacific and Central Pacific land grants. The same legal mechanisms applied. The same political figures were involved. Senator James Harlan of Iowa, who chaired the committee that drafted the Pacific Telegraph Act, also served on the committees that shaped the railroad legislation. The infrastructure of the continent was being centralized through federal subsidy at exactly the moment the country was fracturing along other lines. Entirely. Not coincidence. Pattern. This was not accidental. The mechanism that finished the consolidation was not the 1860 Act. It was a sequence of 3 corporate transactions between 1864 and 1866 that eliminated the last remaining competition and produced the company that would dominate American communications for the next 60 years. The first was the absorption of the Pacific Telegraph Company in 1864. The second was the absorption of the United States Telegraph Company in early 1866. The third, completed on June 12, 1866, was the merger with the American Telegraph Company, which had controlled the eastern seaboard during the war. After June 1866, there were no significant competing networks left in the United States. The financial scale of these mergers was unprecedented. The 1866 American Telegraph merger valued the combined company at approximately $40 million, in a year when the federal budget was around $500 million. Western Union became, by some measures, the second largest corporation in the country, exceeded only by the railroads it shared infrastructure with. The patent wars are the part that explains why the consolidation could not be reversed. Samuel Morse's original 1840 patent on the electromagnetic telegraph expired in 1854, but by then, the relevant intellectual property had shifted to refinements and improvements. Royal House had patented a printing telegraph in 1846 that produced typed output instead of dots and dashes. David Hughes had patented a different printing system in 1855. Both were technically superior to Morse's design for many commercial applications. Both were absorbed into Western Union's patent portfolio through the company's acquisition of the firms that licensed them. By 1867, Western Union held or controlled the licensing of essentially every commercially viable telegraph patent in the United States. What this meant in practice was that no new entrant could build a competing network without infringing on Western Union's patents, and any infringement suit could be litigated for years in federal courts, where Western Union's legal resources vastly exceeded those of any potential competitor. Jay Gould's later attempts to build competing networks in the 1870s and 1880s succeeded only because Gould had access to capital comparable to Western Union's own. Smaller competitors did not survive the legal phase long enough to reach the operational phase. The operators are the part I keep returning to. The National Telegraphic Union, founded in 1863 as a craft organization for telegraph workers, had approximately 15,000 members at its peak. Its records, preserved in fragmentary form in university archives in Pennsylvania and New York, document a workforce that thought of itself the way medieval guild members thought of themselves. The union maintained its own training standards, its own publication, its own mutual aid funds. It struck against Western Union in 1870 and, again, more famously, in 1883. Both strikes failed. By the mid-1880s, the craft system that had trained operators since the 1840s was effectively gone, replaced by company training programs of much shorter duration that produced workers who knew the code but not the equipment, the procedures but not the chemistry of the batteries or the maintenance of the lines. What was destroyed was not just a set of companies. It was a knowledge system. The men who built the original networks understood the entire stack, from the copper of the wire to the chemistry of the cells to the geometry of the relay armatures. They had learned through apprenticeships that lasted years and that moved them between shops and lines and regions. They carried their knowledge in their hands and their notebooks, transmitted person to person, generation to generation. When the apprenticeship system was replaced with company training, the knowledge transfer collapsed within a single generation. By 1900, there was almost no one left alive who remembered how the original networks had been built or by whom. I am not arguing that Hiram Sibley was a villain in any cinematic sense. He was a businessman, operating within a legal framework that rewarded consolidation, and he was extraordinarily good at the work the framework rewarded. What I am arguing is that the legal framework itself was the instrument of erasure, and the framework was not natural or inevitable. It was constructed by specific people in specific committees, through specific legislation passed in specific years, and the construction happened in parallel with similar consolidations in railroads, in banking, in land tenure, in the entire infrastructure of the American economy during the Civil War decade. The same Congress that ended slavery centralized the wires, the rails, and the currency. The historians who write about one of those processes do not always write about the others. Not coincidence, pattern. The records do not tell us whether. The men who drafted the Pacific Telegraph Act understood, in 1860, that they were not building a national network but eliminating one. The records were written by the winners. My friend the conservator wrote to me again last month. She had been cataloging a new donation, a wooden crate from an estate sale in central Ohio, that contained the working notebook of a telegraph operator named Charles Wexler, who had begun his apprenticeship in 1857 and retired from Western Union in 1903. The notebook ran to 400 pages. It contained circuit diagrams, battery formulas, repair procedures, lists of equipment makers, most of whom she could not identify, and a hand-drawn map of the line he had worked between Cleveland and Pittsburgh in 1859, before either of those segments belonged to the company that eventually employed him for 40 years. She sent me photographs of 3 pages. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at them for a long time. What struck me was not the technical content, was the handwriting. The notebook had been kept the way a craftsman keeps a working reference, updated over decades, annotated in different inks as procedures changed and equipment was replaced. The early pages, from the 1850s and 1860s, were dense with diagrams and chemistry. The later pages, from the 1880s and 1890s, were thinner, procedures rather than principles. Charles Wechsler had stopped writing down how things worked, because by then, he was no longer expected to know how things worked. He was expected to follow the company manual. The notebook itself still functions as a reference. My friend showed it to a retired electrical engineer, who told her that the battery formulas and the relay adjustment procedures from the 1860s pages were still technically valid, that the chemistry was sound and the circuit logic was correct, and that with the right materials, a competent technician could rebuild a working 1860 telegraph station from the instructions in those pages. The materials are mostly available. The competent technicians are not. The knowledge of how to read what Wechsler wrote, how to interpret his shorthand and his diagrams, and his references to equipment makers whose names appear in no surviving catalog, that knowledge is gone, except in the small number of museum conservators and antique radio enthusiasts who have spent decades trying to reconstruct it. The wire is still there in places. There are stretches of original 1861 Transcontinental line preserved in Wyoming and Nevada, sections of pole and insulator that have stood for over a century and a half in the open desert. The copper has oxidized, but the conductive path remains intact. If you connected a working key and a working battery to a preserved section of the line, the signal would travel exactly as it did on the morning James Gamble sent the first transcontinental message. The physical infrastructure is more durable than the institutional knowledge that built it. The wire outlasted the workers, and the workers outlasted the companies, and the companies outlasted the legal framework that created them. But the knowledge of how to make another network like the one that existed in 1861 died with the last of the men who had been trained in the old apprenticeship system. We can measure the resistance of the original wire. We can analyze the chemistry of the surviving batteries. We can read the diagrams in the notebooks that happen to have survived. We cannot rebuild what existed in 1861, not because the technology is beyond us, but because the human system that produced the technology was dismantled, and the dismantling was permanent. Why do the textbooks credit Western Union with the construction of a network that Western Union absorbed rather than built? Why was the Pacific Telegraph Act of 1860 written to subsidize a single contractor rather than a competitive process? And why was the contract awarded to a man who used the federal funds to acquire his rivals? Why does the standard history of American communication treat the consolidation of the 1860s as the natural emergence of efficiency rather than as the deliberate destruction of a decentralized system that had functioned for nearly 2 decades? Why do we remember the names of the men who finished the line, and not the names of the men who built the 40 companies that were absorbed into the company that finished it? Why is there no monument anywhere in the United States to the New York and Mississippi Valley Printing Telegraph Company, to the Pacific and Atlantic, to the Erie and Michigan, to any of the firms whose operators and linemen and engineers laid the foundation of American telecommunications and were erased from the record within a generation of their absorption? Charles Wechsler kept writing in his notebook until 1902, the year before he retired. The entries from the last decade are brief and procedural, and tell us nothing about what he thought. He had begun his apprenticeship at the age of 25. He had spent his entire adult life on the wires, and the wires had changed under him until they belonged to a company and a country he would not have recognized when he started. His obituary in the Cleveland newspaper was 4 lines long. It did not mention the notebook. It did not mention any of them, because the people who knew are gone, and the people who took what they built were the ones who wrote down what happened.